June 16, 1944. Philippine Sea, 300 miles west of Saipan. Lieutenant Commander Masatake Okumiya stood on the flag bridge of the carrier Zuikaku, watching the morning search planes return with intelligence that should have been impossible. His plotting board showed American carrier contacts extending across 40 miles of ocean. He counted the formations twice, certain his mathematics had failed him. 15 fleet carriers, and the number made no sense. Japan's entire carrier striking force assembled for this decisive battle comprised 9 flat tops carrying 400 aircraft. Intelligence briefings had estimated the Americans might deploy 8, perhaps 10 carriers maximum. 15 was beyond anything Japanese naval planning had considered possible. But the scout plane reports kept arriving, each one confirming what Okumiya's plotting board already showed. Task Group 58.1, 4 carriers. Task Group 58.2, 4 carriers. Task Group 58.3, 4 carriers. Task Group 58.4, 3 carriers. If you're enjoying this deep dive into the story, hit the subscribe button and let us know in the comments from where in the world you are watching from today. Okumiya had been aboard Zuikaku since her commissioning in September of 1941. He had participated in the Pearl Harbor attack, watching American battleships burn while Japan's 6 carriers escaped without significant damage. He had survived the Coral Sea, where Zuikaku's sister ship, Shokaku, had been damaged, but both carriers had sunk the American carrier Lexington. He had watched from a distance as 4 Japanese carriers burned at Midway, knowing that Japan had just lost the war's initiative in a single morning. And now, 25 months after Midway, he stood on the bridge of one of Japan's last operational carriers, staring at a plotting board that showed American naval aviation had multiplied beyond anything Japanese intelligence had predicted. The Zuikaku represented Japan's finest carrier engineering, 25,000 tons displacement, capacity for 75 aircraft when fully loaded, speed exceeding 34 knots. She and her sister, Shokaku, were the Imperial Navy's most successful carriers, veterans of every major engagement since the war began. Together, they formed the core of Vice Admiral Jisaburo Ozawa's mobile fleet, the last operational carrier force Japan could field. But today, Zuikaku carried 63 aircraft, not 75. Pilot losses over Rabaul, Truk, and the Solomons had created gaps that training programs could not fill fast enough. The maintenance backlog meant 12 aircraft sat in the hangar deck awaiting parts that would never arrive, and fuel restrictions limited training flights to the minimum necessary to maintain basic proficiency. Ozawa's plan relied on land-based air support from airfields on Guam, Saipan, and Tinian. 400 carrier aircraft plus approximately 500 land-based planes would engage the American fleet in a decisive battle that would blunt their offensive into the Marianas. Japanese aircraft possessed longer range than American models, allowing strikes from distances where American planes could not effectively respond. The plan assumed technological advantage, and superior pilot training would compensate for American numerical superiority. The plan assumed the Americans would deploy 8 to 10 carriers, not 15. Okumiya's counterpart on the American side, Lieutenant Commander James Flatley, stood on the flag bridge of the carrier Lexington, the second ship to bear that name after the original had been sunk at Coral Sea. Through his binoculars, he observed the combat air patrol rotating overhead, Hellcat fighters stacked in layers from 10,000 to 25,000 feet. The sight represented industrial capacity that would have seemed impossible 3 years earlier, when America possessed 7 fleet carriers total across both oceans. Lexington belonged to the Essex-class, a carrier design that had revolutionized American naval aviation through standardization and mass production. Construction of the first Essex-class carrier, USS Essex herself, had begun in April of 1941. She commissioned in December of 1942, just 1 year after Pearl Harbor. By June of 1944, 14 Essex-class carriers had joined the fleet, with more launching every month from shipyards that treated these 30,000-ton vessels like assembly line products rather than individually crafted warships. The Essex-class shared a common design that enabled rapid construction and simplified logistics. Each carrier displaced 27,000 tons, standard, 36,000 tons, fully loaded. Flight decks measured 862 feet long and supported air groups of 90 to 100 aircraft. Standardized components meant parts from one Essex could fit any other Essex. Damage that would require months of yard time for older carriers could be repaired in weeks using prefabricated sections manufactured thousands of miles from combat zones. But Essex-class carriers represented only part of America's carrier expansion. Kaiser Shipyards, the same company that had revolutionized cargo ship production with Liberty ships built in days rather than months, had applied assembly line methodology to escort carrier construction. These smaller carriers, built on merchant ship hulls, displaced 11,000 tons and carried 28 aircraft. They lacked the speed and aircraft capacity of fleet carriers, but they could be produced at rates that made individual losses acceptable rather than catastrophic. The first escort carrier, USS Long Island, had been converted from a merchant hull in June of 1941. By June of 1944, American shipyards had commissioned 86 escort carriers. Some served in the Atlantic, hunting German submarines. Others supported amphibious operations in the Pacific. 18 had been transferred to the Royal Navy under Lend-Lease, demonstrating that America's production capacity exceeded even its own operational requirements. Combined fleet intelligence officers in Tokyo had tracked this construction through reconnaissance reports, intercepted communications, and combat observations. Their files documented each new carrier name, estimated commissioning dates, and probable deployment locations, but the sheer scale of production defied traditional naval planning assumptions. Fleet carriers required specialized construction facilities, trained shipyard workers with years of experience, and construction timelines measured in years. Japan's carriers had taken between 3 and 4 years from keel laying to commissioning. Even emergency programs implemented after Midway had only reduced construction time to approximately 2 years for fleet carriers. The Americans were commissioning Essex-class carriers in 18 months. Some had gone from keel laying to combat operations in less than 16 months. Escort carriers took 6 months from hull conversion to commissioning, sometimes less. The mathematics suggested industrial capacity operating on scales that Japanese planners found incomprehensible. Captain Toshikazu Omae, chief of operations for the combined fleet, had compiled production estimates throughout 1943 and early 1944. His reports to Admiral Somu Toyoda documented American carrier construction with the precision of an accountant cataloging inventory. 14 Essex-class carriers commissioned by June of 1944. 86 escort carriers were commissioned in the same period. 9 additional Essex-class carriers under construction, expected commissioning by year's end. 40 more escort carriers in various stages of completion. The disparity became more pronounced when compared against Japanese production. At Pearl Harbor, Japan possessed 10 carriers, 6 fleet carriers, and 4 light carriers. By June of 1944, Japan had lost 14 carriers to combat or accident. Replacements commissioned during the same period totaled 6 carriers, 3 fleet carriers, and 3 light carriers. Net loss, 8 carriers, reducing Japan's operational carrier force to 2 fleet carriers, Zuikaku and Shokaku, plus 7 light carriers of varying capability, but raw numbers told only part of the story. Japan's surviving carriers operated with depleted air groups and limited fuel supplies. Zuikaku's hangar deck should have held 75 aircraft. Instead, she carried 63, and 12 of those awaited maintenance parts that were not coming. American carriers operated at full capacity, with replacement aircraft arriving faster than combat operations consumed them. Essex-class carriers embarked 90 aircraft each. Task Force 58's 15 carriers deployed approximately 1,350 aircraft total, more planes than Japan possessed in its entire remaining naval air force. The production disparity extended beyond simple carrier counts to the industrial infrastructure supporting carrier operations. Each American carrier required fuel, aviation gasoline, ammunition, spare parts, food, and hundreds of other supply items. The logistics network supporting Task Force 58 included fleet oilers that could refuel carriers at sea, ammunition ships that could replenish magazines without returning to port, and mobile repair ships equipped with machine shops capable of manufacturing replacement parts on demand. American carriers could operate for months without touching land, their logistics tail extending back through floating supply depots to West Coast ports where merchant ships arrived daily with materials produced by factories operating around the clock. Japanese carriers required shore facilities for refueling, rearming, and maintenance. Fuel shortages meant every gallon had to be carefully rationed between training, operations, and logistics movements. Parts shortages created maintenance backlogs that grounded aircraft for weeks, awaiting components that might not exist. The combined fleet's remaining tankers faced submarine attacks every time they attempted to transport oil from the Dutch East Indies to forward bases, creating a shrinking fuel supply that forced commanders to choose between training their pilots and conducting offensive operations. The Battle of the Philippine Sea would demonstrate the ultimate consequence of this production disparity. Ozawa's 9 carriers launched their strikes against Task Force 58 throughout the morning and early afternoon of June 19th. 400 aircraft departed Japanese flight decks in waves calculated to overwhelm American defenses through coordinated attacks from multiple directions. Japanese planners anticipated losses, but expected to inflict decisive damage on American carriers through superior training and longer-range aircraft that could strike from distances where American fighters could not effectively intercept. The reality proved catastrophically different. American radar detected Japanese formations at ranges exceeding 100 miles, providing Task Force 58 commanders with time to vector Hellcat fighters into optimal intercept positions. Japanese pilots, many with minimal training due to fuel shortages that limited flight hours, faced American aviators flying superior aircraft supported by fighter direction systems that concentrated defensive strength at decisive points. The engagement, the Japanese newspapers would later optimistically label the Great Marianas Turkey Shoot, saw American fighters destroy 383 Japanese aircraft while losing 29 of their own. 3 Japanese carriers went to the bottom. Taiho, the newest and most advanced carrier in the combined fleet, sank after a single submarine torpedo ignited aviation fuel vapors that had accumulated from improper damage control procedures. Shokaku, Zuikaku's sister ship, and the last surviving carrier from the Pearl Harbor attack, took 3 torpedo hits and sank with heavy loss of life. Hio, a converted passenger liner serving as a fleet carrier, suffered engine failure and was finished off by submarine attack. By nightfall, on June 19th, Ozawa's mobile fleet had lost 3 carriers and most of its remaining experienced pilots. American losses, 29 aircraft, with many pilots recovered by submarine and seaplane rescue operations that treated aircrew as irreplaceable assets worth extraordinary effort to save. The carrier count that had begun the battle told the story of industrial capacity determining strategic outcomes. Japan's 9 carriers versus America's 15 fleet carriers, plus numerous escort carriers supporting the invasion forces. But the count after the battle revealed the true disparity. Japan lost 3 carriers and lacked industrial capacity to replace them. America lost 0 carriers and possessed production programs launching new construction faster than any enemy could sink them. The Newport News Shipbuilding Company occupied 760 acres along the Virginia waterfront, a facility that had been building warships since 1886. In 1941, the yard employed 21,000 workers constructing vessels using traditional methods refined over decades. Skilled craftsmen, many with 20 or 30 years of experience, built carriers one at a time, with each ship representing a unique creation requiring custom fitting of thousands of components. The Essex-class program forced Newport News to abandon these traditions. By 1943, the workforce had expanded to 31,000 employees, many with no previous shipbuilding experience. Women comprised 18% of the workforce, operating cranes, reading blueprints, and welding hull sections with skills learned in training programs measured in weeks rather than years. The yard had been reorganized around assembly line principles borrowed from automotive manufacturing, with standardized components fabricated in separate shops, then moved to the building ways for final assembly. Elizabeth Gardner had worked as a department store clerk in Richmond before the war. In March of 1943, she completed a 6-week welding course sponsored by the Maritime Commission and began working at Newport News for $1.75 per hour. Her job involved welding bulkhead sections for Essex-class carriers, repetitive work that required precision but not the comprehensive shipbuilding knowledge traditional craftsmen possessed. She worked the second shift, 4 in the afternoon to midnight, 5 days a week, with optional overtime, on Saturdays at double pay. Gardner's welding team completed approximately 40 feet of bulkhead seam per shift. 20 welders working simultaneously across different sections of the ship meant 800 feet of welding per shift, 2 shifts per day, totaling 1,600 feet daily. The entire carrier required approximately 60,000 feet of welded seams, meaning a ship moved from bare hull to completed welding in roughly 6 weeks, with parallel work proceeding on multiple decks simultaneously. Traditional riveting would have required 4 to 5 months for the same work with larger crews of more specialized workers. The standardization extended beyond construction methods to operational design. Every Essex-class carrier used the same engine configuration, same radar systems, same aircraft elevators, same catapults, same arresting gear. A maintenance technician trained on one Essex could service any Essex without retraining. Spare parts manufactured for one ship fit any ship in the class. Damage control procedures developed on one carrier applied to all carriers, creating institutional knowledge that accumulated across the fleet rather than remaining isolated on individual vessels. This standardization enabled production rates that Japanese observers found impossible to accept. The carrier Intrepid, 5th ship of the Essex class, was laid down on December 1, 1941, just 6 days before Pearl Harbor. She launched on April 26, 1943, 16 months later. After fitting out and sea trials, she was commissioned on August 16, 1943, 20 months from keel to combat readiness. The carrier Bunker Hill required 18 months from keel laying to commissioning. Wasp, the second carrier to bear that name after the original was sunk at Guadalcanal, needed only 15 months. Japanese intelligence officers tracking this construction compiled reports that seemed to describe industrial fiction rather than observable reality. Commander Yoshitake Miwa, assigned to Naval Intelligence Analysis in Tokyo, had studied at the Naval War College in 1937. His specialty was comparative industrial production, and his pre-war estimates of American manufacturing capacity had been considered pessimistic by combined fleet planners who believed his figures overstated American capabilities. By 1944, Miwa's estimates had proven wildly optimistic, underestimating American production by factors he was still struggling to comprehend. Miwa's office occupied a converted classroom in the Naval Ministry building, its walls covered with production charts tracking American construction programs. Essex-class carriers showed as vertical bars, each bar representing one ship with dates marking keel laying, launch, and commissioning. 14 bars clustered between December of 1942 and June of 1944. 9 more bars extended into late 1944 and early 1945, representing ships already under construction. The chart looked like a forest of data, each tree representing 30,000 tons of steel and 90 aircraft that would soon be hunting Japanese vessels across the Pacific. A second chart tracked escort carrier production, Casablanca-class carriers built by Kaiser Shipyards using the same assembly line methods that produced Liberty ships showed construction times averaging 3 months from keel to commissioning. 50 Casablanca-class carriers had been commissioned between July of 1943 and June of 1944, representing 550,000 tons of new carrier displacement in 12 months. Japan's entire carrier construction program since Pearl Harbor had produced 6 carriers totaling approximately 90,000 tons, and 3 of those had already been sunk. Miwa had attempted to brief combined fleet staff on these production figures. In March of 1944, his presentation included photographs obtained through intelligence sources showing multiple Essex-class carriers under simultaneous construction at Brooklyn Navy Yard, Newport News, and Fall River Shipyard in Massachusetts. The photographs depicted construction methods that contradicted everything Japanese naval doctrine taught about carrier building, requiring specialized facilities and multi-year construction timelines. The briefing had been received in silence. No questions about methodology, no challenges to the data, no requests for clarification. Just silence, followed by Admiral Toyoda thanking him for the information and moving to the next briefing topic. Miwa understood the message. The data was accurate, was accepted as accurate, and would be filed away, because acknowledging its implications required acknowledging that Japan was fighting a war it had already lost, mathematically. But the mathematics were undeniable. American carrier construction, by June of 1944, totaled 141 vessels, 14 fleet carriers, 6 light fleet carriers, and 121 escort carriers. This figure included carriers transferred to the Royal Navy and carriers still conducting training in American waters. The combat-ready force available for Pacific operations numbered approximately 90 carriers of all types. Japan's remaining carrier force comprised 9 carriers total, reduced to 6 after the Philippine Sea battle. The ratio was worse than 15-1, and it was still growing because American production continued while Japanese construction programs stalled due to material shortages, labor shortages, and increasingly frequent air raids on industrial facilities. If you find this story engaging, please take a moment to subscribe and enable notifications. It helps us continue producing in-depth content like this. The human cost of this disparity became apparent in pilot training programs that reflected each nation's industrial reality. American naval aviation training began with primary flight instruction lasting 12 weeks. Students flew Stearman trainers, simple biplanes designed for instruction in daily flights that built fundamental skills through repetition. Primary training alone required approximately 75 flight hours, more than some Japanese pilots accumulated in their entire training pipeline by 1944. Advanced training added another 30 weeks with specialized instruction in carrier operations, navigation, gunnery, and tactics. Students transitioned through increasingly complex aircraft, SNJ trainers that approximated combat aircraft performance before finally checking out in Hellcats or Dauntlesses, depending on their designation as fighter or dive bomber pilots. The complete pipeline from civilian to carrier-qualified aviator required approximately 14 months and 300 flight hours. This training consumed enormous quantities of aviation fuel, approximately 100 gallons per flight hour. A single student pilot burned through 30,000 gallons of fuel during training, equivalent to what a Japanese frontline squadron might receive for a month of combat operations. But American petroleum production supported this consumption without strain. Domestic oil production exceeded 5 billion barrels annually, with additional imports from Venezuela and Mexico. Training programs consumed perhaps 2% of total aviation fuel production, an acceptable cost for producing pilots who arrived at combat squadrons with skills that had been literally drilled into muscle memory through hundreds of repetitions. Japanese pilot training in 1944 bore no resemblance to this systematic development. Fuel shortages forced training commands to reduce flight hours to absolute minimums. Primary training dropped from 12 weeks to 8, then to 6. Advanced training compressed from 6 months to 3. Total flight hours before assignment to combat units fell from over 200 hours in 1941 to less than 100 hours by mid-1944. Some replacement pilots arrived at carrier squadrons with fewer than 70 flight hours total, barely enough time to master basic aircraft handling, much less the complex skills required for carrier operations under combat conditions. The result was predictable. Inexperienced Japanese pilots faced American aviators who had been systematically trained to competence through industrial-scale instruction programs. The Philippine Sea Turkish shoot reflected this training disparity as much as it reflected aircraft quality or tactical doctrine. Japanese pilots flew aircraft that were, in some cases, superior to American equivalents. The Mitsubishi Zero still possessed better maneuverability than the Grumman Hellcat at low speeds. But maneuverability became irrelevant when inexperienced pilots faced opponents who had been trained to exploit every advantage through hundreds of hours of practice against instructors. Simulating enemy tactics, Commander Okumiya survived the Philippine Sea battle aboard Zuikaku, which escaped significant damage through luck and skilled ship handling. In the days following the engagement, he interviewed surviving pilots from other carriers, compiling observations for what he knew would be his final operational report. The patterns emerged clearly from pilot debriefings. American combat air patrols had been positioned perfectly, radar-guided to intercept positions calculated to maximum advantage. American fighters attacked in coordinated pairs, using altitude and speed advantages to dictate engagement terms. Japanese formations broke apart under pressure, individual pilots fighting alone rather than supporting each other because they lacked the flight hours to maintain formation discipline under stress. One pilot, Petty Officer Saburo Sakai, a veteran with 6 years of experience and 64 confirmed kills, described watching newly assigned pilots die within minutes of first contact. They lacked situational awareness, failed to check their rear sectors, and fixated on targets directly ahead while American fighters dove from altitude in attacks the new pilots never saw coming. Sakai had survived through skill and experience, but he knew he represented the last generation of Japanese naval aviators who had been trained properly. When he died or became too injured to fly, there would be no one with equivalent skills to replace him. The industrial dimension of carrier operations extended beyond construction and training to maintenance and repair capabilities that multiplied American advantages. When the carrier Franklin was hit by 2 bombs off Okinawa in March of 1945, the damage killed 724 crew members and gutted her flight deck. Any other navy would have written off the ship as a total loss. Franklin sailed under her own power back to Pearl Harbor, then continued to New York for repairs. She was conducting sea trials by July, 4 months after suffering damage that should have sent her to the scrapyard. Japanese carriers lacked equivalent damage control capabilities. The carrier Taiho, sunk at the Philippine Sea, went down after a single torpedo hit because her damage control officer made a fatal error, allowing aviation fuel vapors to accumulate throughout the ship. One spark from an electric motor ignited the vapors, triggering explosions that tore the carrier apart from within. Better damage control training, the kind that required time and systematic instruction rather than memorized procedures, might have saved the ship. But Japan lacked the institutional capacity to provide that training when fuel shortages meant every gallon had to support either training or combat operations, never both simultaneously. The carrier count by war's end told the final story of industrial capacity determining strategic outcomes. The United States commissioned 141 carriers between Pearl Harbor and September of 1945. Losses during that period totaled 12 carriers, 4 fleet carriers, and 8 escort carriers. Net gain: 129 carriers, creating a force structure so vast that dozens of carriers never saw combat because the war ended before they completed training and deployment. Japan commissioned 6 carriers during the same period and lost 20 carriers total, including all 10 carriers possessed at Pearl Harbor. Net result: negative 14 carriers, a fleet that had been systematically destroyed not ship by ship in decisive battles, but through attrition against an opponent whose industrial base produced replacement vessels faster than combat operations could sink them. Admiral Toyoda's staff compiled the final accounting in September of 1945, preparing documentation for the surrender ceremonies aboard USS Missouri. The carrier production figures appeared in appendices marked for historical record rather than operational use. 141 American carriers were commissioned versus 6 Japanese carriers. The ratio, 23-1, exceeded even the most pessimistic pre-war estimates of American industrial advantage. But the numbers alone could not capture the human dimension of this industrial transformation. Elizabeth Gardner, the former department store clerk who became a shipyard welder, had helped build sections of 8 different Essex-class carriers during her 3 years at Newport News. She earned enough money to buy a house, support her mother, and save for college after the war. Her story multiplied across hundreds of thousands of American workers, men and women, who found opportunity in wartime industries that paid premium wages for work that directly supported military operations. The woman next to Crane 7 at Kaiser Shipyards, the one earning $1.80 per hour building Liberty ships, had a counterpart at every carrier shipyard in America. Workers building Essex-class carriers at Brooklyn Navy Yard earned similar wages, often with overtime, that pushed weekly earnings to levels that exceeded monthly wages for Japanese factory workers by factors of 10 or more. This wage structure created economic incentives that made American war production a voluntary enterprise rather than a coerced mobilization. Workers chose overtime shifts because the pay justified the effort, creating a self-sustaining production system that operated at maximum capacity without requiring government compulsion. Japanese industry could not match this model. Worker wages remained fixed at pre-war levels, even as inflation eroded purchasing power. Material shortages meant factories operated below capacity, regardless of worker willingness, and strategic bombing, beginning in earnest during 1945, destroyed production facilities faster than they could be rebuilt or relocated. The Kure Naval Arsenal, which had built Yamato and multiple carriers, suffered repeated B-29 raids that reduced its capacity by 80% before war's end. Commander Miwa's final intelligence report, submitted in August of 1945, included photographs of American carriers anchored at Ulithi Atoll. The photographs showed over 60 carriers visible in a single frame, their flight decks empty of aircraft because the planes were conducting operations over Japan itself. 60 carriers in one harbor, more than Japan had possessed in its entire navy at any point during the war. The image required no analysis, no complex calculations. The photographs documented industrial supremacy so complete that further combat had become mathematically impossible, regardless of tactical skill or fighting spirit. Okumiya stood on Zuikaku's deck on August 15, 1945, when Emperor Hirohito's surrender announcement reached the ship. The carrier had survived the Philippine Sea. Though 2/3 of her air group had not, she had limped through subsequent operations with dwindling fuel supplies and maintenance backlogs that kept half her remaining aircraft grounded. By August, she sat anchored in Kure Harbor, immobilized by lack of fuel and surrounded by the wreckage of Japanese naval aviation. Carrier after carrier lay capsized or burning in the shallow harbor, victims of American air raids that treated even anchored carriers as threats worth eliminating. The surrender terms required Japan to dismantle its remaining naval forces under Allied supervision. Zuikaku would be scrapped, cut apart in the same shipyards that had built her 4 years earlier. Her steel would be recycled, perhaps finding use in reconstruction projects or civilian manufacturing. The carrier that had fought at Pearl Harbor, Coral Sea, and the Philippine Sea would vanish, leaving only photographs and veterans' memories as evidence she had existed. Across the Pacific, the carrier Lexington, the second ship to bear that name, sat anchored in Tokyo Bay on September 2nd, 1945. Flight operations continued overhead as B-29s conducted flyovers during the surrender ceremony aboard Missouri. The Lexington had been commissioned in February of 1943, fought through 19 months of continuous operations, and remained combat-ready with full air groups and supply stocks sufficient for months of additional operations. She represented industrial capacity that had fundamentally transformed naval warfare from contests between individually crafted vessels into struggles between entire economic systems. The final count showed 141 American carriers built during the war versus Japan's 6 replacements for 20 losses. The mathematics told a story of industrial mobilization, achieving what tactical excellence could never overcome. Fighting spirit, superior training, and advanced weapons design had proven insufficient against opponents who reconceived naval warfare as a production problem to be solved through systematic application of assembly line methodology, standardized components, and wage structures that made maximum industrial effort economically rational for workers building ships. Japan had entered the war counting American carriers and calculating that eliminating this finite force would secure the Pacific for a generation. The count at Pearl Harbor showed 7 American carriers in the entire fleet. The assumption was that these represented maximum capacity, fixed assets that could not be rapidly replaced. The assumption proved catastrophically wrong because it counted existing forces while ignoring industrial potential. The Americans did not fight with 7 carriers. They fought with the capacity to build 141 carriers, and that capacity, once mobilized, proved more decisive than any weapon, any tactic, or any level of martial spirit. Thank you for watching. For more detailed historical breakdowns, check out the other videos on your screen now, and don't forget to subscribe.